Now this is a pretty comprehensive model about how prominence works in English. And we now have two questions. The first question is, what are our students likely to struggle with? And the second question is going to be then, how can we turn this is about listening to the sounds, how can we then turn this into the actions which underlie these different levels of prominence here? What are going to be the things we do with ourselves to create this? The answer to the first question, what was the first question? I'm going to say first. Oh yes, what are they going to have problems with? The answer to the problem is every language pitch accents on syllables. From a technical point of view, intonation in English might be a bit different from some other intonation systems, but every language has a system of putting pitch changes onto syllables. However, when we get to stress, the way that stress works in English is different from the way that things which are called stress works in some other languages. And in particular, this idea that English stress is louder from an acoustic point of view is different. That doesn't happen in regular, normal French or Japanese or some languages like that, for example. So that's going to be an area where our students struggle. And also in reduction, many languages don't have reduction in the way that this happens in English. So these are the areas where our students are likely to struggle, in which we need to understand what do people do with themselves to reduce stress in English, what do they do with themselves to reduce syllables in English. And let's start off with stress. Now I said that phoneticians kind of got a bit lost in the 1950s to about the 1990s on the issue of stress. It wasn't true of all phoneticians. And in particular, our hero and the patron saint of the PROMSIG should be a man called J.C. Catford, Ian Catford, who was a British phonetician who started life as a language teacher. He worked as a language teacher in the Middle East. He ran the English teaching unit, I think, at Edinburgh University. He ended up as a professor of phonetics at Michigan University in the States. And he was absolutely clear. This is one of his great books, A Practical Introduction to Phonetics. He was absolutely clear. Stress is initiator power. And for him, the initiator of speech, by that he meant the respiratory system, because that's where all sounds, that's where the whole system starts getting going. So he was very clear. Stress is about initiator power. And we can take another quote, a man called Peter Roach, who used to be the professor of phonetics at Reading, saying something very similar here. Stress syllables are all about making more effort, increasing the air pressure inside the lungs. And then the effect of this extra effort is, yes, the syllables come out a bit longer, they come out a bit louder, there might be an involuntary pitch change on them or whatever. But it all starts with, stress starts and ends with the respiratory system. If you get that right, then you're getting stress authentically. The problem we have with this is that when we're producing normal conversational English, the amount of extra effort we have to put in on the stress syllable is minimal. You know, it's absolutely tiny. They do experiments. They have done experiments where they put needles into people's throats below the vocal fold to measure changes in subvocal pressure. And the effect is there. You can see that English speakers are doing this, even on normal, regular speech. But we can't, you know, unless you make yourself very sensitive to it, as the old phoneticians did, it's very hard to actually feel this in yourself. Nevertheless, it is there. Interestingly, this is a model, this is the most basic model you can imagine about how speech breathing, how our respiratory system works for adults. And that is that we just inflate ourselves like a balloon. And then because we've stretched all our tissue in our torso, that compresses the air inside us, and that helps to drive the air out. There's a bit more to it, but that's not a bad approximation of what's going on. Interestingly, for children, the physiology of a child's chest wall is very different. And for children, actually, the respiratory system works a bit like a brown paper bag. They open themselves up, but there's no pressure generated as a result of stretching tissue. They have very floppy, soft tissue in their chest walls, children. So when they want to produce stresses, they want to raise their pressure in their lungs, they have to actively compress themselves each time. So stress for a child learning English, and a child learning their first language, is a very physical activity. But by the time we get to adults, we've kind of lost touch with the fact that stress is happening at this level here. Nevertheless, what we found in our teaching is that putting even adult learners of English as a second language back in contact with this is a very important step, because otherwise they're going to stay rooted in the way they control their breath in their native language, which won't have this pulsatility, which is at the root of English. So how do we go about doing that? What we want to have is to replace a very smooth way of compressing air with something choppier, something a little bit pulsatile. And to do that, we have to get people to understand how it is that they push air out of their bodies. Now, this is a very quick lesson in physiology. The way that we get air out of our bodies, first of all, doesn't involve the diaphragm. The diaphragm is an inspiratory muscle. All the diaphragm can do is to pull air into you. The way that we get air out of our bodies, we can compress our rib cage a little bit, but basically it's with these muscles here at the level of the belly. We've got lots of so-called abdominal muscles down here. And just like when you have a tube of toothpaste, you squeeze at the bottom and the toothpaste comes out at the top. In exactly the same way, if you squeeze yourself here, air comes out at the top of the collar. And we can put our students in touch with this just by getting them to do simple exercises where they just push air, for example, out of their noses. Now, there's an English word to snort, and you can actually snort in or snort out. But we're talking about snorting out here. And it's actually make, when you blow your nose, you make a very pronounced and hard snort. If you just make a gentle snort, and I'm going to ask you to do that now, on a single intake of breath, you can make 3 or 4 little snorting gestures where you're pushing air out of your nose. And when you're doing that, just put your hands on your bellies and just feel how your belly moves in. So just snort a few times. And you can feel how in fact, it's not that the snort is pulling the belly in. By pushing the belly in, you're pushing the air out of you. By pulling your belly in, you're pushing it. So just do a few snorts, a few more snorts to get yourself into contact with what's going on here. So, there are a number of ways in which one can work on students' speech breathing in order to get their stress right. We haven't got time to do all of them, but there's a number one way. This is the simplest and most basic way of getting onto this. And what it means is that when one is asking students to reflect on sentences, we all ask the question when we're teaching transition, how many sounds are there in this word? We all ask the question, how many syllables are there in this phrase? The students have to become sensitive again to these sorts of questions. How many sounds, how many different sounds, how many syllables? There's another question, which is, how many pulses are you going to need to make in order to say this sentence? And if you phrase it in terms of pulses, that's immediately throwing them back to the fact they're going to have to do something in order to put these stress syllables on. And obviously in the 2 sentences we had, my watch has stopped, there are 2 pulses there. And in I allowed myself an hour, if the myself is just quite reduced when you say it, you've got loud and hour, 2 things which are stress. So again, just same exercise, put your hands here, but this time make a conscious effort to actually pull your belly in when you're saying the stress syllables on my watch has stopped and I allowed myself an hour. Just have a go with it for a couple of times. So like all aspects of pronunciation, we need to hyper-articulate. When we're learning pronunciation in the mouth, the articulation, one needs to hyper-articulate, and then one can gradually pull that in and make the actions more economical. In a similar way, when one's working on speech breathing, you have to start by getting the students to hyper-articulate, which in this case means making very tangible movements with their respiratory system, with their abdominal muscles, and then they can start to automatize that and get the feel of how it works in English. And all the other syllables in a phrase get said on the extra energy which is available, or the leftover energy from these pulses here. English is very much a pulsatile language. The fact that rock music works best with the English language is no coincidence. Rock music has this heavy beat, and that works very well with the English language, because that is how we speak.